And I also want to emphasize the lenders I'm talking to are telling me that 70 to 80% of their calls are people who aren't yet facing a hardship, but really just want to know what their options are.
Now, the CARES Act specifically states that borrowers do not have to prove any financial hardships, no documentation. Doesn't that kind of open up the door for a considerable amount of fraud?
There's certainly a concern there. We're operating on the honor system. We are asking and we're putting together a script for servicers. This is supposed to be limited to if you've lost your job, you've lost income. Please, if you haven't lost your job, continue paying. There's servicing capacity in the industry is down by 25, 30%. We have to triage this like everything else. So it's important that if viewers are listening and they're thinking about trying to hold their liquidity for a month, if you can pay your mortgage, please do so, because we really need to focus on those people who can't.
Look, almost 40% of mortgage loans are not government-backed, are not FHA, they're not Fannie Mae. What about those other borrowers?
Great question. I think if this only goes on for 2 or 3 months, Ian, worst case scenario of what we see is, say, 20, 25%. I think most of the servicing industry, certainly Fannie and Freddie, could make it that time. If this goes beyond 2 or 3 months and we start to get worse than that, then that's going to be some real strain, and certainly we're going to see some firms get into a lot of liquidity trouble.
Now, some lenders are talking, and specifically the former CEO of Citibank had comments today that we could see more delinquencies and possibly more foreclosures than that of the 2008 subprime crisis. Your thoughts on that?
So that's up to the lender, but we've had a lot of conversation with the bigger lenders. We've really tried to get out there and set some standards. And of course, what Congress did was essentially codify much of what FHFA had already started to do. We've worked with FHA. So while the government loans are not the overall market, my sense is probably about 95% of the market are following very similar circumstances. We're trying to put some guidelines out there, use a little moral suasion, trying to get everybody to offer the same terms so that for borrowers, when you call, you get treated the same regardless of what loan you have. And as you know, many lenders offer a whole suite of loans. And I think most of those lenders want to try to be able to give a consistent experience to their borrowers regardless of the loan product.
So there you go. Did you make your mortgage payment? It is around the 1st. Do you plan on making it? Hit us up Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Your feedback has been amazing. Thank you. Keep it up. Dr. Eric Topol, an American cardiologist, geneticist, and scientist. He is the founder and director of the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California. He also serves as chief academic officer for Scripps, a professor of genomics at the Scripps Research Institute, and a senior consultant at the Division of Cardiovascular Diseases at Scripps Clinic. He is editor-in-chief of Medscape and Heart.org. He has published 3 bestseller books on the future of medicine, Scripps Research, and tonight he also issues a warning that the U.S. will surpass all other countries in coronavirus deaths. Are we in the midst of the worst health crisis and the worst handling of the health crisis in the history of the world?
Well, I don't think there's any question about that. The problem is the 45 days, the critical lack of response. So the first patient in the United States was diagnosed in Washington State January 21st, the same day as that in Korea. And we didn't have essentially any testing for the 45 days. And that allowed for this massive spread throughout the country. And so now, even though there's a surge of testing, it's so late, and there's been so much extraordinary infectivity throughout the U.S., and we're seeing hot zones, of course, in many different cities. So, as you pointed out, there is a lot of testing right now, but the critical period was missed, and that difference is South Korea contained the outbreak. They flattened the curve very, very quickly. They had very limited number of deaths. They had extensive testing, whereas we are going to see, of course, a big toll in deaths, and we were the epicenter of this pandemic.
Not looking to place blame anywhere now, but why are we now the epicenter when we watch this happening all over the world?
We can't just rely on testing because it's so late and because there's such a high rate of people who are either asymptomatic carriers or have indeed been hit with COVID-19. So one of the most important things that we're not doing is digital tracking and tracing. And that is to use the things that people wear, like their smartwatches or their phones or taking body temperature. These digital tracking tools can tell us where the next cluster of people are starting to have either abnormal resting heart rate, like the study we just launched last week, or body temperature increasing, or other signs before we have another hot zone. And that's something, if we got a large number of Americans involved, we could stay ahead of this and know where and when something was erupting.
Why or what accounts for us being so slow in getting these tests out there?
I think the first point is that we were the only country in the world that rejected the WHO test. And so, as I mentioned, in South Korea, they used that, at least initially, until they got a quicker turnaround test. And every other country used that test. But we rejected it and never had a test in place that could be done accurately and at scale until right around the 45-day point after the first patient here. So that was a terrible breach, and that will account for a lot of unnecessary deaths going forward because we didn't get ahead of this.
Dr. Topol, your time, your insight, amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
The news the last few mornings has started with anchors from a national level saying, here's the news, and it's not good. We all now have come to accept, but how long did it take? For a small town in northern Nevada, the news over the last several days has been more than not good. Words to describe it can be tragic, unbelievable, downright heartbreaking for many of us. You may or may not have heard of the senseless murder of a father, husband, son, brother, classmate, and friend. The death of Officer Ben Jenkins of the Nevada Highway Patrol. He graduated in my class. I last saw him at my 20-year class reunion back in 2010. I remain and have been friends with him on Facebook. As shocking as his death was to the small community of Elko, from what I saw, from their response as a community, was what has been, and I believe still to this day to be, what America as a whole is all about. A compassionate, loving, understanding, helping one another, supporting one another, and loving one another nation. The procession for him had to be close to 10 miles long. The city stood on the sidewalks from one end of town all the way to the other. It was an amazing sight, an amazing tribute. It was unprecedented as to anything I've ever seen before. Ever. If you haven't seen any of the videos, Google it. There's some amazing footage there honoring an even more amazing man. This is the America I know. We shall overcome. In the meantime, let's be vigilant. Let's be compassionate. Let's be caring. Let's be loving to one another. Just like Ben was. Until next time, Americans, this is Chad on Demand, keeping it real.